All right, this video involves a discussion of 3 case studies. However, in class, you're going to choose one of these 3 case studies. So we're actually talking about the class itself. One of these 3 studies would have been chosen by you based on a vote. And however, they all share similarities. There's a commonality between them. And that commonality is that the central figure in the story murdered another person, in the case of the Cleveland Facebook killer, or in the case of the other 2 studies, killed multiple people on behalf or in pursuit of a desire that they had. So all 3 case studies involve murder for some kind of personal gain. And so you can obviously see right at the beginning why this would be included in a radical egotism case study. In all 3 cases, these individuals were willing to sacrifice, literally discard the lives of others for the sake of some personal desire or goal that they had. Now, while you as a class will have studied one of these, I do want to mention, and I do want to in this video discuss all 3 because I'm not sure which one you obviously would have chosen as a class. So we have the 3 case studies. The 1 case study is Sandy Hook Massacre, which occurred in 2012 and involved this individual, Adam Lanza, going into an elementary school after having murdered his mother at home and killing roughly 20 children, 5 or 6 administrators, as well as taking his own life at the end of his rampage. We have Steven Stevens, who in 2017 murdered another random person, somebody who he had no connection with whatsoever, supposedly on behalf of a desire to get back at his girlfriend, or his ex-girlfriend. And then we have, finally, the Chris Watts story, which was very recent, 2019. And the Chris Watts story involves a father who had, 2018, but who was a father who murdered his wife as well as his 2 young daughters. I believe they were 5 and 3 at the time, as well as the unborn child that his wife was carrying at the time of the murder. And he did so in pursuit of continuing an affair that he had begun. Okay, so again, you have these 3 individual case studies. In each case study, someone or multiple people die because the killer wants to gain something for himself. Maybe they don't actually attain this, but that's the basic goal. And so you can see right off the bat that, look, this is radical egotism at its height. This is the fullest manifestation of radical egotism, the most extreme form of radical egotism. It involves, once again, as I said earlier in this video, individuals who are literally willing to kill other people, discard their lives, as well as destroy or upset or, dramatically and traumatically alter the trajectory of the lives of the people that loved this murdered person forever. Okay, so let's go through the motives. And here's where some similarities as well as some differences will emerge. So in the case of Adam Lanza, you have the situation of this young man who had, severe kind of mental conditions. He was an Asperger's person, individual on the extreme. He was completely antisocial. His mother had tried to get him help. Although his mother also becomes part of the issue, she makes some morally questionable decisions as well. I'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, so he had, for years, kind of steadily withdrawn into himself, was a big kind of video game guy, very violent video games. He was someone who tracked the list of serial murderers and mass murderers, people that had killed a lot of individuals in one setting. He had a list, very detailed time, place, names, everything like that. And so he decides that he is going to go on this rampage. And again, he starts off by killing his mother, goes to the school, shoots up all these little kids, kindergartners, first graders, as well as administrators and teachers, before he finally shoots and kills himself as the authorities approached. Okay, so what could cause this? What could the motive possibly be? Well, the police offer two different potential motives. One is the video game motive, where he wanted to kind of live out a violent video game in real life, a Call of Duty type of game. He wanted to be the person that was the killer, the rampager, so on and so forth. And his murder at the end, if you go with the whole video game explanation for his behavior, the police have associated with kind of being like a gamer. You don't want to be killed, because if you're killed, your points go to someone else. There's another video game, there's another motive that can be associated with Adam Lanza, and that is the glory killer motive. And in the glory killer motive, essentially what you're trying to do is to attain fame. You want to become known. You want the quote-unquote glory of being the deadliest mass shooter in U.S. history, or a mass shooter who does something so horrific that your name goes down in the history book and you will not be forgotten. In either case, the ultimate point is that you want to be known for this act. You want to go down in history. You want fame. And ultimately, one could argue, it's in pursuit of immortality. You want for the rest of history to be known as one of the most horrific or one of the most lethal shooters that America has ever seen. Now, if we look at both the video game motive and the glory killer motive, in both cases, we have a situation where radical egotism is apparent. Because whether it's to kill others in order to live out a video game fantasy, or to kill others in order to gain fame for oneself, in either case, the end is you. The only benefit goes to you, if there is, in fact, a benefit. And so in that case, to kill others for a fantasy or to kill others for your own fame, you can see how that is a form of radical egotism. Literally, your life or your goal or your desire is the only thing that matters, because literally, people can be wiped off the face of the earth in order to achieve a fantasy or in order to achieve this objective of being known after you die. Now, it's also the case that Adam Lanza killed himself at the end. And one could argue, or one could question, well, how could that be a form of radical egotism? If he kills himself, he's obviously not doing it for himself. However, if part of this rampage involves him realizing that, look, he's not going back, and one of the reasons he may not go back, he's not going to make it out of it, is because he doesn't want to face the consequences. That's a potential way in which someone in this situation, and it also applies to the Cleveland Facebook killer, could think. Like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go down in history, or I'm going to live out my fantasy, and after that, it's done. Because I don't want to face the victims. I don't want to face the families whose lives I've shattered. So you can actually see the suicide at the end as a form of this extreme radical egotism. Now, is there any other kind of objection, right? Is there anything that one could say, not in defense of this action, but against the thesis that this is a form of radical egotism? It's hard, if not impossible, to do so. But one could argue that he was insane, that he didn't know what he was doing. He was delusional. He was so into his own head that he had no clue that these were real people that he was actually murdering. Now, there's reasons to kind of argue against that. Certainly one could offer a rebuttal to that and say, look, he had all these long lists of names. This was premeditated. This was pre-planned. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't some kind of just psychotic break where he lost touch with reality. No, this was a long process that was leading to this point where these little kids died. Okay, but anyway, if you did take that case, right? So if you did take the objection, and that was your position, that look, he was so insane that he had lost touch with reality, that he didn't know what he was doing, he didn't know the consequences. Well, in that case, we're still in the paradigm of radical egotism. This action was still radically egotistic, because whether he was fully aware of what he was doing or not, the reality is that these people are dying for a fantasy, or these people are dying for a twisted delusion, or these people are dying for a desire. Now, the question with insanity is really one of whether it's not a question of whether this action was an instance of radical egotism. The question is whether he is morally responsible. Did he know what he was doing? Did he have some kind of control? Could he have done otherwise? And again, somebody that makes the argument that he is totally insane, he had lost touch with reality, might argue that no, he was not responsible, even if his actions were still immoral and they were still a form of radical egotism. Or if one wanted to kind of take a different position and object to this idea that he was insane, he didn't know what he was doing, then you can go with the whole thing. Well, it was premeditated. He had these lists, so on and so forth. But that's really the debate about Adam Lanza and about the other figures as well. The only way to argue that they were not responsible for an act of radical egotism is to argue that they were insane. I guess there's one other option as well, and you could literally adopt the position of subjective or individual relativism and say, look, I'm taking it to the extreme. I really do believe that there is no right and wrong. There is just individual opinion. And so if you take that position, you could still argue that, yeah, this is a form of radical egotism for sure. People died for the fantasy, or people died for his fame. However, one might argue that in this case, Lanza's not wrong. He's not any better or worse than the teachers that threw themselves in front of bullets in order to protect their students, in order to try to stop him. No one is more right than another. They're just different opinions. And that's the consequence of literally believing and adopting this position of relativism in its individual or subjective form. Okay, so that's the one case study. Now, I spent more time on this case study because, again, many of the themes that are mentioned in this study are also found in the other two. Okay, with Stephen Stevens, now here you don't have a case of a long-term mental disability, or at least not a long-term diagnosed mental disability or mental problem. You have an individual who lives in Cleveland. He liked to gamble. He was a guy that liked to think highly of himself. His friends describe him as kind of a talker. But you have an individual who also has this girlfriend. There's a breakup, and he decides that he's going to Facebook Live this act of murder, and that the act of murder is not directed or is not aimed explicitly at his girlfriend. However, she is involved, and she's involved because what he decides to do is he decides to just kind of drive the streets of Cleveland and just find somebody, random person, somebody he doesn't know. Could be you, could be me, could be your neighbor, could be your friend, could be your mother, your father. And he decides that he's going to pull up to this person and he's going to murder this person, again, on Facebook Live. If you're on his account or page, I don't really know how it works, but if you're on his account or page, you would have seen this if you were watching at that time. And he drives up, he pulls up, and not only does he murder this guy, Goodwin, an old man coming back from church, so on and so forth, but he makes this guy repeat the name of his girlfriend before he shoots him. And so here, you could say, look, this is an act of vengeance. And again, it's very easy to see why this is an act of radical egotism. It's an act of radical egotism because he wants to use this person for a vengeance fantasy or revenge fantasy. Or, look, maybe he was trying to get Facebook famous, just like the Sandy Hook killer. In either case, just like with regard to the Sandy Hook killer, the same logic applies. He is a radical egotist because whether it's for the sake of living out a revenge fantasy or whether it's for the sake of gaining some kind of Facebook fame, in both cases, you have an instance of someone who is literally willing to throw out the lives of others and destroy the lives of others. In this case, just one other. But it really doesn't matter because he's willing to destroy the life of this other person for the sake of his personal desires. There's no reason to kill this Goodwin. Now, Stephen Stevens, just like Sandy Hook killer, also kills himself at the end. The police, he's spotted at a McDonald's. There was a manhunt. He's spotted at McDonald's. Police are called in, and he is then chased. And before he's caught, he ends his life. And again, same kind of logic would apply. One could argue, well, this is not a case of radical egotism because he killed himself at the end. However, one could also argue it's radical egotism because he didn't want to face that family. He didn't want to face jail. He didn't want to actually deal with the consequences of his actions. Now, I think the one kind of difference here is certainly the numbers of people that are killed. One could wonder whether that is morally relevant or not. In both cases, you're talking about innocent people, but the numbers may or may not matter depending upon how you argue. And the other thing is, again, this is a kind of more described as a snap. Does that, if you argue that, look, he's not morally responsible because he snapped, he didn't know what he was doing, he was in a fit of rage, he was unaware, well, that is potentially different than someone who has a condition for a long period of time that maybe could be addressed, rectified, so on and so forth. Okay, now the final case study that you had the option of exploring would be the Chris Watts story. Again, very recently, and so in this story, essentially this guy, Chris Watts, he is, kind of mid-30s, young, early to mid-30s, wife same age, daughters, 2 daughters, young, 5 and under, as well as a baby on the way. And he begins an affair with a coworker, and like many affairs, he gets totally into it, is totally smitten, just wants to be with this girl, this mistress, as much as possible, takes her out to dinners while his wife is in North Carolina with the kids, with family. So he pursues this affair, he's enjoying it, obviously, and the wife comes home with the kids from their North Carolina trip, and he murders them. And he then stuffs their body. He digs a shallow grave for his wife and then stuffs the body of his children into these pipes, these oil tank pipes at his work. Gets up the next day, acts as if nothing has happened. The coworkers describe him as perfectly normal, no change. The wife goes missing, because a friend comes over or something like that. And he makes these pleas on television that I just want my wife back. I'm devastated. This is horrific, so on and so forth. And then eventually it comes out. His stories are not adding up. The mistress, the affair, the person with whom he's having the affair, gives some information to the police because again, he's lying to her. He's trying to just change the subject. He just wants to talk about their relationship rather than the fact that his wife and kids are missing and then are eventually found. Their bodies are discovered. And so here, you have some differences because there is the similarity of the murder in pursuit of a personal objective. Just like Sandy Hook, just like Cleveland Killer, people die so this guy can get what he wants, so he can fulfill a desire. You might say it's even more radically egotistic because, look, why didn't you just pursue the divorce or the separation? If you're going to have an affair, all right, that's one thing, and we can debate about the morality of that another day. But you didn't have to murder these people. You didn't have to murder your family, right? So that's also a little bit of a difference here. Sandy Hook Killer killed his mother, but most of the people that died were random strangers, innocent people that he had no connection with. Here, he's killing his wife, and whatever guilt or whatever his wife may have done, or whatever their status of the relationship is, he also killed his daughters, 5 and 3 years old, completely innocent, and as well as the unborn child. So no reason to die. So there is a similarity in the sense that people die for a desire, and that the people who die were innocent. Now, the difference here is that he doesn't seem to be doing it for fame. He seems to be doing it just for the kind of the short-term goal of this physical pleasure. And in this case, there's not clear instance of insanity. Now, one could argue, and he made the case, when he was kind of eventually being found out, that he snapped. He saw his wife mistreating his one child, and he snapped, and he wasn't able to control himself. So you could make the argument that he was insane and therefore not morally responsible. However, the case in this regard is less strong. I mean, there's less reason to believe it. This seems more of a pure kind of act of selfishness. Now, to do something like this and to be able to act the way that he did afterwards, again, act like it's perfectly normal, carry on with his mistress, kind of try to change the subject, to act like that, perhaps that's an instance of psychopathy, where he literally cannot feel emotional grief or pain or remorse because he just can't feel sympathy for others. Now, that could be the case. And maybe one could argue that psychopathy is a cause of this decision and is a form of insanity, and therefore he's not morally responsible. However, again, it goes back to the question of, well, even if he is a psychopath, even if he doesn't care about others, why not just, go the route of the divorce or separation rather than the murder? So again, to wrap up, in all three cases, we have acts of radical egotism. We have acts where people die so other individuals can fulfill their fantasies or their goals or their objectives. And that is the height of radical egotism, to destroy the life of another, to discard it for the sake of one's own objectives. And really, the only question is, are they morally responsible? Did they have any control in any of these cases? And so, while the motives differ a little bit, and that central question does remain. Were they responsible? Did they have control? All right. So with that, these are sad, tragic, and awful things to think about, but they're also excellent examples of what it means to act in a radically egotistic way.